Good afternoon, children. This is the second segment of the third lesson of Standard 7. This is Anuradha Datar. Welcome to you for my geography class. Before starting the class, I would like to request all of you to be attentive in the class. Please have your textbook, a ruler, and sharp and attentive mind and willingness to study and understand the lesson. In the first segment, we have studied about the different types of tides which occurs, the high tide and the low tide, because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. The diagrams here in front of you tells us about at the place A1 and A2, we have a high tide. Either it is the combined pull of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon causing a high tide, whereas the place B1 and B2 will have the low tide. The high tide and the low tide occur, it's a daily movement of the water. It is a very natural phenomenon. We also have studied the gravitational pull of the moon is stronger as the sun is far away from the earth, and therefore the high tide is much higher because of the moon's attraction force or the moon's gravitational force. After knowing this, let us study about some important types which are being called as an spring tide and neap tide. The diagram here which explains to us about the position of the sun, moon and the earth. The sun, moon and the earth, either on the full moon day or new moon day, they are in the straight line. The combined pull factor, the combined force results in giving the high tide. The high tide is much more higher and the low tide is lower in the case of spring tide. It occurs on the full moon day because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon act jointly, forming the water level to rise. What happens on the for the neap tide? In the case of neap tide, the moon, earth and the sun are in the right angle. It is just like a tug of war. They pull the water both by the sun and the moon, and therefore the water level doesn't rise as high as neap tide. So high tide is not much high and the low tide is not much lower, which experiences a neap tide. Let us find out if the spring tide occurs on the full moon day and the new moon day, on which day the neap tide occurs. It is occur on the first and the third quarter of the month when the moon, earth and the sun are in the right angle. Now let us examine how this spring tide looks like. The diagram is from your textbook. The sun, moon and the earth are in the straight line. It is on the full moon day, the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon act in the same direction. Due to this, the total pull increases, hence the tide on these days is much higher than the average high tide. This is known as spring tide. As the bulge of the high tide is greater, the water of the low tide recedes much more and the water level during the spring tide is higher than the average high tides and lower than the average low tide. So we have to remember spring tide, three important words we have to remember: full moon day, new moon day, highest of high tide and lowest of average, lower than the average. Lowest of low tide occurs on the spring tide. Important tide, again same diagram from your book. They are in the right angle. The sun, earth and the moon are in the right angle. While revolving around the earth, the moon takes a right angle with respect to the earth and the sun. Twice the sun or the moon. This position occurs first and the third quarter of the month. Both of these days, the forces both of the sun and the moon operates at a right angle. So I just give you the example of the tug of war, and therefore the gravitational pull of the moon, which is at a right angle, act on the sea water. Due to such condition, water level rise is less than usual at the time of high tide. Similarly, fall in the water level is less than the usual at the time of low tide. So you have to remember, in the first and the third quarter of the month, we found the neap tide when the sun, earth and the moon are in the right angle. They make an angle of 90 degrees. The highest high tide is not very high and low tide is not very low, little higher than the average low tides is very important fact one has to understand. The another force which I want to you about it. This two diagrams you have to name as an high tide and the low tide, the spring tide and the neap tide. The water level rises, water level decreases. Now, generally the highest high tide occurs on the full moon day and the new moon day, whereas the days of the first and the third quarter, the high tide is at its minimum. Spring tides and neap tide are the two type of tides. It's very, very important. Match the following to draw the diagram, name the following, the characteristic of the tide. It is comparison between the spring tide and neap tide. One cannot forget, it's very easy to remember. It's very easy to remember. Just remember the tug of war. The another important impact which I tell you, which is not discussed much in our book, but that also affects the tide. As we have learned earlier in the second lesson, the position of perigee and apogee also causes or also has an impact on the tide. The perigee, the earth is much closer to the moon, and apogee is earth is farther away from moon, and therefore perigee we found the very high tide which occurs on the much more higher in the perigee position. When it is in the apogee position, the height of the high tide is not very high. The another important factor which I want to highlight about the gravitational pull of the sun also affects the tide. We have learned about the two positions in case of the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. When the moon when the sun is in the northern hemisphere, the high tide which is being caused, it is somewhere in the it is just remember we call this two position an aphelion and perihelion. When we see it is the perihelion, this is the time in the solar tides are the greatest. When during the summer in the northern hemisphere and the winter, the solar tides are usually smaller as it depends upon the sun. When sun is in the northern hemisphere, the high tide occurs in the northern hemisphere. When is in the sun is in the southern hemisphere, high tide occurs in the southern hemisphere. Very easy to remember. The gravitational pull of the sun also affects the tide. Another position, the effects of perigee, which we have already explained to you. Just I thought, let me highlight the position of perigee and perihelion and aphelion, the position for you to understand how the tides occur. This is the orbit of the earth. This is the orbit of the moon. Once a month, a perigee, when the moon is closest to the earth, the tide generating forces are higher than the usual, producing average range of the tide. But 2 weeks later, when it is in the apogee, when the moon is farthest from the earth, the lunar tide's rising force is smaller than the tidal range is very less than the average. It's very important function we have to understand. When the water level rises up and the water level doesn't rises during the spring tide, the tidal range is much more. When the tidal range is not much more, when the high tide is not very high and the low tide water doesn't recede much, it is during the neap tide, the tidal range is less than the average. The another important aspect which I have already talked to you about, aphelion and perihelion position, is also one important factor which also contribute to the height of the tide or to the type of the tides which occur. Just quickly summarizes effect of the tide which is being found on a large scale to the people who are living in the coastal areas. We know that the tides are nothing cyclic rise and fall of the ocean surface caused by the forces of the moon and the sun acting on the ocean. Changing tide produced at a given location is the result of the changing position of the moon and the sun relative to the earth, coupled with the effects of earth rotation. The effect of tides can be noticed to a greater extent. The large number of people who are directly and indirectly depend on the water's resource or on the seas for their livelihood. So people like who catches, who goes for the fishing is being influenced. The large number of people who works on the tourism on the tide is also get influenced. The estuaries which are being found in the coastal areas, water brings the sediment and sea cliff that feed and nourish the life also gets affected. Let us quickly highlight some point of just see this is the time during the high tide water enters and then these small boats or the fishermen who can go for the fishing activity. This is the intertidal zone portion of the shoreline that lies between the high and the low tide, and the areas have high level of sunlight, nutrients and the oxygen. After discussing about the tides, it is very important the tide effect. Just let me highlight the few points. The tide has a profound influence on the people living in the coastal areas. They help in the number of different activity. The first and the most important thing which affects to the common man that it allows to enter the ships into the sea when there is a time of high tide. It take away the large amount of waste again back into the water and brings some material and helps in building the different types of beaches in the coastal areas. The people help in making the salt pan at the time of high tide. The water enters into the salt pan and can be stayed there, and this it helps for the salt manufacturing processes, which is a part of our daily dietary habit. The tidal force also used to generate the electricity. It is called as a tidal energy. It is a non-conventional type of energy and it is more eco-friendly. It is very important to understand how occur in the different region at a different time. Now, every day we know that the tide doesn't occur at the same time. A tide means, I mean high tide and the low tide doesn't occur on the same time. The reason behind it, it is very important. The earth completes its one rotation. The diagram in front of you, it is P. It is the antipode of P is F. If these are the two places when they are having a high tide, when F becomes the P, it is another 12 hours. We see that the earth has moved little bit forward. The moon has moved a little bit forward. It is approximately 6 degrees 35 minutes. So the Earth has to cross that many degrees ahead because the moon has already moved a little further. And that's why we know that the Earth has to cross every day the Earth has to cross 12 degrees 50 minutes or 12 degrees 30 minutes distance. It means we know that every day it is the tide which occurs 50 minutes later than the previous day. Tides are continuously occurring phenomena. After reaching the maximum water level during the high tide, the low tide sets in. Similarly, after reaching the lowest water level during low tide, the high tide sets in. Remember the following discussion. The highest limit of the high tide and mentioned in the figure 3.9. This is called the daily movement or the daily change in the timing. It will take 24 hours for the P point to come to the P will be the point F after 12 hours. The same change will occur with reference to the point F. Try to explain these different types of the tides which occur at a different period of time. Unlike 24 hours a solar day, a lunar day lasts for 24 hours 50 minutes. That's a basic concept one has to understand. This occurs because the moon revolves around the earth in the same direction that the earth is rotating on its axis. Therefore, it takes the earth an extra 50 minutes to catch up to the moon since the earth rotates through the two tidal bulges. Every lunar day, we experience two high and two low tides every 24 hours and 50 minutes. Here we see the relationship between the tidal cycle and the lunar cycle. High tides occur 12 hours 25 minutes apart, taking the 6 hour 12.5 minutes for the water at the shore to go from high to low and then from low to high. Please understand this diagram carefully. This diagram helps us to understand the satellite moon which revolves around the earth. The time taken is almost the lunar lasts for 12 hours 15 minutes and earth completes 24 hours one rotation. The Earth completes 24 hours in one rotation and Moon takes last for 24 hours and 15 minutes. It is a very important concept. It is called as a tidal theory. Why the time of tide changes every day. Important concept which I just want to show it. Just observe this. How the Earth, it is a model which is I've got it from the internet. You can see how the new moon day and the neap tide and the spring tide occurs just for you to understand. And here the phases of moon also which is being shown to you. I thought it will be beneficial for you to look at this. Yes. The next tides occur lunar day and the solar day. It is just for your information, 12 hours and 50 minutes for the water at the shore to go from high to low or from low to high. And therefore 20 hours and 50 minutes is the time difference between the two tides of a high that is called as in 24 hours is a solar day which time takes for a specific site on the earth to rotate from an exact point under the sun to the same point under the sun. Similarly, the lunar day is the time it takes for the specific site of the earth to rotate from an exact point under the moon to the same point under the moon. Unlike solar day, however, the lunar day is 24 hours and 50 minutes and the lunar day is 50 minutes longer than the solar day because the moon revolves around the earth in the same direction that the earth rotates in its axis. So it takes the earth an extra 50 minutes to catch up to the moon and therefore we say that it takes 50 minutes an extra time to from the The next important concept is about the ocean waves. I've already told you about the ocean waves is nothing but the horizontal movement of the water. And this horizontal movement of the water is very important. It has the crest and the trough. The distance between the two crests is called as an wavelength. We know that the waves are formed because wind blows across the surface of the ocean, creating small ripples, which evenly become waves with increasing time and distance. When the waves reach shallow water, they become unstable and begin to break and can impose a large hydrodynamic forces on organisms living in this region. See now, these are the waves which are being generated. If you throw any object in the waves, it will appear that it will come, it will float, but it might not reach to the coast. Similarly, as we feel that it is approaching, but it might not reach to you. The velocity of the wave. If we stand on a coast, we feel the waves are coming towards the coast. If a floating object is thrown on a distance in the sea, we find the object is moving up and down and the same place. It does not come back to the coast. It means the water forming the waves also does not come to the coast. Remember that the water in the wave does not move. What moves is the energy. It's very basic fact one has to understand. What moves is the energy. Water does not come to the coast. The important point. The waves are nothing but the as you blow the air over the hot milk, the ripples which are being formed. The sea water moves up and down or slightly forward and backward due to the waves. These waves bring the energy content in them to the coast. They break in the shallow waters near the coast. For example, large number of sports which are being played because of the generation of waves, and they are really exciting. Let us analyze what are the different types we have seen the occupations which are being practiced. These are some pictures of the salt pan at the time of high tide. Water enters and the salt is manufactured. I've already told you that there are the different activities which are being practiced based on the coastal areas. These are the water sports which are becoming very common in India and abroad, the people having the coastal areas. These are becoming the famous tourism places in the world. So I think I have completed tried to explain to you with few of my PowerPoint presentation how and why we have a spring tide and a neap tide. Why the moon day, the lunar day and the solar day are different, or we often say that why the tide comes 15 minutes later than the previous day, because we are following the calendar. I hope I have helped you in understanding this. If you have any doubts, please don't hesitate. Ask me. I'll be there to help you. I love teaching geography and I will love to make some more efforts for you to understand the concept. Thank you. Take care.